Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's Friday Forum. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so excited to welcome you to today's event with Anjuli Fatima Raza Kolb discussing her very timely new book, Epidemic Empire, Colonialism, Contagion, and Terror, 1817 to 2020. She is joined today in conversation by Gauri Viswanathan. Harvard Bookstore's Friday Forum takes place on Friday afternoons during the academic year as a way to highlight scholarly books in a wide range of fields. Through virtual events like today's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we're hosting events here on Zoom, and as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. Today's discussion will conclude with some time for questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you'd like to buy a copy of Epidemic Empire, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you, especially during this difficult time for community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you'd like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever supports the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you so much for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now, I am so pleased to introduce today's speakers. Anjuli Fatima Raza Kolb is Associate Professor of English at the University of Toronto, where she teaches post-colonial literature and theory and poetry. She holds a PhD in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia University, and her poems, translations, and essays have appeared in various venues and are in conversation with the traditions of Urdu poetry, contemporary queer poetics, and lyric memoir. She is joined by Gauri Viswanathan. Gauri is a class of 1933 professor in humanities at Columbia University. She has published widely on education, religion, and culture, 19th century British and colonial cultural studies, and the history of modern disciplines. She is the author of Masks of Conquest, Literary Study in British Rule in India, and Outside the Fold, Conversion, Modernity, and Belief. Today, they are discussing Epidemic Empire, which uncovers the history behind the dead metaphor of the terrorism epidemic, by looking at documents of public health, policy, immigration law, novels, poems, films, and more. I'll leave you with this quote from Jasper K. Puar from Rutgers University. Uncannily succinct, yet historically profound, Epidemic Empire allows us to glimpse the future of pandemics from the racial prisms of the past. This temporal arc is sublime and the writing exquisite. And on that note of praise, I'll turn things over to our speakers. Anjuli, Gauri, thank you so much for being here. I'm looking forward to hearing this conversation.
Thank you so much, Audrey. And this is really just an enormous pleasure. Audrey and Lauren and everyone at Harvard Bookstore, I especially want to give thanks to you guys because this Harvard Bookstore has been my absolute favorite #1 place since I was a teenager, and is still my favorite place to visit when I'm home. I'm excited to be with you all, and especially excited to be with my beloved teacher, Gauri, to celebrate the release of my first book. In Epidemic Empire, Colonialism, Contagion, and Terror, 1817 to 2020. And yes, my editor mocked me by asking if I wanted the date range to be 1817 to infinity. I study the overlapping discursive, literary, political, and medical histories that have made the notion of an epidemic of terrorism a defining strain of common sense in the 21st century. I've come to think of this book as a deep dive into a shallow metaphor with all of the potential risks that entails. You have to leap long and try not to break your neck. This phrase, epidemic of terrorism, and its various metaphorical elaborations have defined contemporary Islamophobia. Islam and Islamism, strategically imprecise uses of these terms, are a cancer on the human condition, a plague on reason and progress, embedded and insidious retroviruses, ideological contagions. Although I began the book long before the COVID-19 pandemic, our moment has had no shortage of intersections with the research I did. In addition to the absolutely shocking and nightmarish spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans, much like the hate crimes against those perceived to be Muslim in the years after 9/11, the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, was immediately associated with indiscriminate Asianness, and those who appeared to be other in the European and North American contexts have suffered grave harm as scapegoats for the kind of thinking drummed up by villainous politicians, including the thankfully former President of the United States. At the start of the outbreak, anticipating a dramatic wave following Eid al-Fitr, the Western media wondered whether Muslim gatherings would become super spreader events. In the wake of these wonderings, mosques in Salt Lake City and Missouri were vandalized and burned in apparent hate crimes. This is in March and April of this past year. The same politicians who called for essential workers and the elderly to martyr themselves to the economy pathologized Muslim martyrdom just years before. The conceptual and moral incoherence is staggering. Viral, epidemic, and pandemic figures typically work, I argue, to maintain a clash of civilizations thesis of the kind popularized by Samuel Huntington in his 1996 book of the same name, Clash of Civilizations. In my own archive, I look at how commentators on the Algerian Revolution, the Indian Mutiny of 1857, the conflict in Kashmir, the Iranian Revolution, and the current global migration crisis, for example, reach for the forceful image of Islamist and terrorist epidemics in order to shore up a notion of the healthy civilizations of the global north, while at the same time constructing the global south, post-colonial states, and the Muslim world, terms that are used again in strategically imprecise ways, as zones of rampant infection, roiling virality, and raging epidemic, poised to break out at any moment and fell the global order. Disease in this imaginary is conjured as an analog for rebellious, mutinous, insurgent, or irregular violence, categories outside of a concept of just war that create a foundation for theories and legal definitions of terrorism as a particularly virulent species of non-state or anti-state violence. In this framework, all acts of war and neo-imperial expansion and soft annexation are recoded as acts somehow of care. I write about how the casual language and official justifications of neo-imperialism, especially European and US American, begin in the wake of September 11th attacks to adopt the figure of epidemic, not just as a ready metaphor, but also as a disciplinary key to thinking global terror. The United States Institute for Peace, for example, suggested in a 2005 briefing that, quote, given the dynamic, unpredictable nature of Islamist militancy, we are drawn to an epidemic conception as a way of thinking and acting in response to this threat. This approach draws on the scientific principles and practices of epidemiology, as well as insights from a growing body of research on social contagion phenomena, such as fads, rumors, and civil violence. Indeed, social scientists increasingly look to epidemiology to understand a variety of contagions, and here, Islamist militancy is no different. It too can be deconstructed using the classic epidemic model. That's the end of the quote from the United States Institute of Peace. For other policy experts and government agencies as well, including the Department of Homeland Security, epidemiology becomes a productive method in the 21st century for analyzing, combating, and securitizing a phenomenon that is understood to be virulent, shapeless, and evasive, but that nevertheless remains the object of an ongoing war. The possibility of a not yet existing epidemic was used by Justice John Roberts to defend the Muslim ban in 2018. My research in the literature, colonial, medical, and military history, demographic and administrative reports, and official counterinsurgency documents tracks how these figures come to be so strongly associated with the non-West, with brown and black people, with failed states, and with the so-called problem of Islam in contemporary geopolitics. I build on a minor but crucial point in the great subalternist historian Ranajit Guha's essay, The Prose of Counterinsurgency. In that essay, Guha observes the tendency in the colonial record toward depicting peasant insurrections as natural phenomena. They break out, he observes, like thunderstorms, heave like earthquakes, spread like wildfires. And though he doesn't return to consider the figure further, they, quote, infect like epidemics. In other words, he writes, when the proverbial clod of earth turns, this is a matter to be explained in terms of natural history. A persistent feature in colonial historiography, this strategy, I argue, not only dehumanizes agents of historical change, but also, as in James Mill's indelible work of Enlightenment historiography, The History of British India, excludes nonlinear models of history as irrational and, in fact, ahistorical. It is not just the naturalization or the organicization of history that is at stake in this figure. The very concept of epidemic and its methods of study are wedded to colonial history and epistemology, specifically to the history and study of cholera, the first global epidemic. In building out the mutually reinforcing histories of terrorism and epidemic, I reach back to the foundations of colonial discourse, to its administrators and recorders of history who favor a disease poetics of empire. The feted British Indian historian J.W.K., for example, who pronounced in 1850, when there were cholera pandemics raging all around him, that there is nothing more contagious than rebellion. But I also look to its novelists and lyric observers. As most students of colonial literature know, Rudyard Kipling's infamous lyric, The White Man's Burden, urges the moral colonialist to take up his duties, to civilize and enlighten the irrational children of the hotter climates, but also to fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. Tasks, Kipling asserts, that come with neither glory nor reward. My work in this book interrogates how this admonishment to care in the context of comparative imperialisms is neither an accident nor a rhetorical infelicity. It establishes and constantly reinforces a sense of the colonized and underdeveloped worlds as both sick and the source of sickness. Empire's disease poetics shapes colonial history and historiography and solidifies the intractable association between race, violence, and epidemic. In so doing, the epidemic thesis produces an inhuman or natural enemy in order to obscure and invalidate political demands and to justify a global security apparatus in defense of humanity, a category that is constituted by its exclusion of phenomena perceived as contagious, like terror, like Islam, like non-white people. As we have learned or relearned over these last months, even epidemics are not natural in the sense that their courses are shaped profoundly by human interaction and human behavior. The COVID-19 pandemic has been exactly as cruel as we have allowed it to be. What I offer in the book is the background that helps explain the horrific injustices of our present moment, racial, imperial, capitalist, and yes, scientific. I'm going to stop here with the introduction, and I'm really very excited to discuss this book with my teacher, my mentor, and my friend, Gauri, and to hear your questions.
Well, Anjali, let me begin by congratulating you on this magnificent book. It's an achievement that I knew was always going to be there from, I don't know when, from the time that I think I knew you as an undergrad, and then of course as a grad student. But this is a remarkable book, and I think it speaks so, I think it's so prophetic in some ways. It speaks so acutely to the moment and to this concatenation of issues that you were just describing now about race violence and epidemics. And I think one of the real achievements of this book is the the way that you draw out the genealogies of political violence at the intersection of public understandings of disease and infection. And I think, as you just said in your introduction, one of the things that we have learned so painfully over the last year is that these public health issues, like dealing with a pandemic, requires us to think not in terms of just individuals, but as collectivities, as a social body. And I think this understanding of the social body is, the entry point into your, I think your this kind of this profound insight that you develop, that insurrections, rebellions, mutinies, anti-colonial uprisings, anti-colonial struggles often moved away from their origins in people's desire for freedom. But instead, that desire for freedom became associated with disease, with infection, with something that had to be treated. And it's a discursive move that has had, profoundly toxic effects on relations among peoples and exacerbated tensions between communities and races and ethnicities. So I think that's really one of the great achievements of this book, that you've been able to show the nexus between disease and political struggle, and how that political struggle is constantly striving to be recognized as an expression of the aspirations of the people. So I think that to contextualize it within the epidemic is one of the really important moves that you make here. I wanted to begin our discussion by asking you about just the way that you were looking at this very long history that you bring into the story. You cover a very wide time span. And I think one of the most striking aspects of the book is the way you use history. It rarely functions as backdrop, nor is it the obligatory contextual material that one needs to decipher a text, just in the way that sometimes you read history in order to read a text. And this kind of bifurcated move is something that you eschew. Rather, you see history as part of a network of meanings that literary texts make accessible. In other words, you're not saying, here I'm giving you the history, and now I'm giving you the literature, so let's see what we can make of each. No, that's not how you want to go about it. You evoke Walter Benjamin to describe the way that the past is blasted. This is Benjamin's term, the past is blasted to open up a space for critical reflection of the present. So what I want to ask you is, how does blasting, in the Benjamin sense of the word, how does blasting figure as a reading method for you, allowing you to move from Bram Stoker's novel Dracula at the outset of your book to the 9/11 Commission report, which is your final chapter? Now, how does that notion of blasting give you the trajectory of this book from Dracula to the 9/11 Commission report?
Thank you so much for this beautiful question. And I think, especially for students or people who are working on their first books right now, I want to mention, because I think it's important to be transparent about these things, that Gauri and I have been having this conversation for 10 years. Like, how will I build the architecture of what was a thesis, and then how does it become a defensible architecture for a book? And I don't know, I just want to say it's a difficult question, and it was one that was with me until the very end of drafting the book. You raised a lot of really generative and rich issues, so I'll kind of work backwards through them. On the question of history and the Benjaminian blast of the leap of the past, like a tiger's leap, he calls it, into the present, I think one thing I want to say is that diseases and revolutions, so not diseases because revolutions are like revolutions, but both things are emergent phenomena in the sense that it takes time to build. We don't have a kind of consistent record of anti-imperial uprisings the same way that we don't have a consistent record of really public civil rights actions. So in these emergent phenomena, there's a broken line of history. So right from the beginning, you have to navigate a nonlinear resurgence, something that gathers energy and gathers strength and then explodes into the wider world. So too with epidemics, they are responsive to historical, ecological, and political factors. And so we call something an epidemic not because it's consistent across time, but because it exceeds its endemic region. So both of these stories are necessarily broken lines, dotted lines, and to connect them is difficult work. I also want to say that it was really meaningful to me as I was doing research for this book to discover that disease is a kind of archive. And what I mean by that, I'll give you an example from the book, is that in the early chapters of Camus' La Peste, The Plague, which is a 1947 novel. I think it's also interesting that that novel was published in the year of Pakistan and India's independence, because it was really profoundly influenced by Algerian independence movements as well, or at least I think it was. So in those early chapters of La Peste, everybody in Oran, which is the town where the novel is set, is getting sick, and they're going around asking each other, what is this? What is this? What is this? What do we have, right? So the problem of the first chapters of the book is an etiological problem, meaning how do we name this disease that we have? And a number of people, a number of characters in those early chapters say, well, is it cholera? And so even in the question, what are we suffering? The disease stands as an archive of a previous moment in the past. And symptoms are a way of close reading how that disease becomes a kind of archive. So I think figuring that out was really helpful for me, that every disease outbreak calls up the memory of previous disease outbreaks. And we saw this at the beginning of COVID-19 too. Like, is this like SARS? Is it like MERS? So those analogous actions that our minds take in order to make sense of something, they dredge something up from history. They bring it back into the present. And I think of that as being a kind of Benjaminian process of understanding.
That's what I really love about this approach, because in a way, what you are doing is reading epidemiologically. It's an awkward word for me to say, but it is a method that you employ. And I think what you just said about trying to identify a disease through the symptoms and trying to create a holistic picture using induction to surmise what might be the cause of disease. I mean, I find that a very instructive way of thinking about reading texts, whether they're literary texts or they're historical texts, that in a sense that what you are acknowledging is the limitations of a single piece of evidence as sufficient for explaining what the cause of the disease is. And that what you're forced to do is, in a sense, to keep looking, you know, whether it's looking elsewhere in a different in a geographical region, or whether it's looking at it in a different time, whether it's in the past, remote past, or more recent past, or maybe even imagining, you know, what the future might represent for, you know, the shape of the disease. So it's a very interesting way of thinking about reading epidemiologically when you are reading these texts. And that really brings me to a question that has been so much on my mind when reading your book, which is, the extent to which our understanding of disease today hinges on our ability to recognize its modes of transmission. In fact, the word transmission has become part of our lexicon in 2020, in the pandemic age. As we fret over increasing infection rates and the like, we keep talking about transmission and transmissibility and the rapid rates of transmission of the new variants. So, I find the word transmission, in our present day context has actually a lot of significance in your book. And I find it very interesting that your book does something different with the idea of transmission, building on its epidemiological significance to suggest alternative ways of narrating history. So that in your reading of historical events across time and place, transmission seems to me to function as a counterpoint to models of linearity or cause and effect, which are generally the traditional building blocks of writing history. So this to me is one of the signal contributions of this book. And I wanted to ask whether you can say more about transmission and networks as they figure in your book, because you talk a lot about migration. You use the trope of migration to talk about beginning with Dracula, the invasion of the European shores by the foreign other, and the idea that danger and disease are a function of the transmission of outsiderness into, kind of a pristine European society. So I was just very curious to hear about how, you would think about these networks, of communication, of communicability, as something that you are working with as as perhaps a more appealing way of thinking about history, rather than the linearity, the sequencing of historical events.
I just have to pause for a second to reflect on what a pleasure it always is to talk to you. Like I'm learning more about my book, just listening to the way that you're asking questions. It's very exciting. So I think it's incredibly useful to talk about transmission instead of cause and effect as both a reading practice that I employ in this work and also as a kind of theory of history. Let's say to take COVID-19 as an example, we would be completely bonkers to imagine that there is a single action that produces or prevents vulnerability. So for example, getting the vaccination is not a panacea, right? We need to keep wearing masks. We're not sure if there's transmission by fomites. We definitely know it's transmitted by respiratory droplets, but saying it's just one of those things and the cause and effect is very clear would be a completely inadequate way of imagining how this disease works. A disease demands an ecological and networked approach, and I think reading does as well, especially if you're reading comparative literature, if you're reading across times and spaces. So the transmission model is interesting to me in that way because it really tries to stay honest to the idea that there isn't one linear cause and effect between times and places, that there are networked causalities that interact with each other in very complex ways. So to give another example, the British response to the mutiny in 1857 was determined to some extent by the spread of cholera, which weakened British troop responses to the uprising. So we need to think about those two things together if we want to have a complete understanding of history. I'll say just a tiny little thing about transmission and literary figure, because I think, I learned this in your classrooms, that a figure or a metaphor can be an idea, a phrase, a trope, to use the broadest possible term, can be almost like a little car that drives you from one text to another. It can become a bridge or an attachment. So when we see something like the blood-soaked soil in Dracula coming back as a trope in Kipling's writing in 1917, we can begin to understand how textual networks influence each other. It's almost like watching a virus travel from one person to another. It's like a phrase will travel from one text to another. And it's a matter of reproduction that, again, is not linear, and it's difficult to call it cause and effect, which, as you say, is a more traditional way of writing literary history. This text influenced this text, and then this other one came, and then this other one responded to it. We're talking about something much more dispersed and networked. So a final word on this. I think it's important to remember that we're talking about something dispersed and networked precisely because the extension of empire was itself the building of networks. It was the building of textual, epistemological, and capital networks by water, by boats, by rail, by roads.
Right.
And so that shape, of course, is the shape you have to work in, because that's the history that we're studying.
Now that's a great point, and I think that you're coming back to empire and its spread, its consolidation. I mean, even the language. I inadvertently use the word spread. And you think about how what you are saying is just absolutely spot on. That the way that the European empires consolidate precisely through these networkings, and it's not just networks of, in a kind of material sense, but also networking between culture and economics, the way that there's this kind of reciprocal relationship between different areas of activity. But even as we're talking about networking, going back again to the language of disease, of contagion and infection, we were talking about a way of writing history that eschews the linear models. But and I think you pointed this out so well in the book, that even as there's this kind of networking effect that is, there in this nexus between contagion, empire, and terror, you also find at the same time a kind of return to these more compartmentalized ways of thinking about history. And the word that comes to mind, of course, is quarantining. And there are a number of times when you talk about quarantine in the book. And I think at one point you say that you use the word quarantining deliberately to suggest ways in which not only persons, but histories and memories are isolated in order to consolidate management by the state. So that, if rebellion is recoded as disease, as contagion, how does the fact that uncoding that identification of rebellion with contagion becomes more difficult when rebellion becomes permanently established in the historical archive as contagion, to kind of go back to a state when the aspirations of a people are rediscovered becomes extremely difficult through these activities that are, again, kind of just written with the disease metaphors. If there's infection and spread, there's also quarantining, and there's a kind of cutting off of history, cutting off events from each other, reinforcing the perception that they're discrete and isolated from one another. So I'm not sure if I can ask you to say anything in a few minutes that would really be to do justice to what I think the book actually does do, which is in a sense to ask us to think about how the language of disease can be unpacked from its historical, if I can use the word historical permanence, as that historical memory has been preserved. And I found that especially true when you came to your Salman Rushdie chapter, which I thought you ended on a very hopeful note when you propose that the epidemic that Rushdie portrays in the Satanic Verses is also associated with the politics of affiliation. It's just the opposite of isolation and quarantining. It's about kind of recovering the meaning of what has been overlaid on aspiration and dreams and imagination, and recovering those dreams and aspirations, but then finding it through the figure of the epidemic in a politics of affiliation. So I was very interested to hear you say more about that politics of affiliation. Of course, it's a very Edward Saïdian term, to talk about affiliation. But I wondered, whether you could say more, because the book, despite its very, a sharp critique of these earlier phases of history, I think it comes out with this really beautiful end right at the, the final pages of the book. And I'd love to hear you say more about the politics of affiliation.
You're leading me to something that's hovering over the entirety of the book and maybe isn't as explicitly explored there as I feel now, a year into the pandemic, which is we are so strongly trained to think of contamination, transmissibility, interpenetration, contact as being dangerous. This is such a Western legacy of sanitary individualism. There is another way of thinking about being, which is as collective being where even on a cellular level, we appreciate that we are inhabited by other living beings, right? And we're inhabited by each other. In studying the history of relational ontology, going back to Frantz Fanon and his reading of Hegel, I think there's a model in post-colonial thought that really shrugs off the crazy idea that any of us are monads and moves towards something like an organismic understanding of being, a collective understanding of being. And in Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, it's very interesting because he stages this affiliation not through a contagious epidemic, but through an instance of breast cancer. And that breast cancer, which is a non-transmissible phenomenon, it's a spreading phenomenon within the body, but it's not transmissible body to body. But the suffering of one woman creates a community of grief and a community of hope and a community of prophecy. And I think the best moments of the last 8 months have been the ones in which I've seen my neighborhood, my family, my groups of friends, my colleagues show up for each other and experience the vulnerability of a shared state, not as something to panic about or to call terror or to immediately prophylaxis quarantine is a complicated concept and we don't really have time to delve into it too deeply, but affiliation can come out of shared states of suffering and shared states of vulnerability in ways that made decolonization possible. So I think that, in the best of times, post-colonial subjects have taken in that violent language that calls our politics contagious and said, okay, you know what? This is a spreading phenomenon. I reach out and I hold your hand, and now we're something greater, and now we're something bigger. And that sense of shared subjectivity, of collectivity, I think is just the flip side of the coin of contagion. If something can spread in the capillaries and networks and nodes that's bad, then so too can something revolutionary and important spread through those networks. That's really a Foucauldian insight that I don't explore for much of the book, but it is in that hopeful moment at the end of the Rushdie chapter. I mean, I think it also just, sorry, go ahead.
No, this is just so beautiful to hear you, describe that sense of a community that's shaped by shared grief and suffering, and which is really what makes me wonder about disease as metaphor, because that's one of the operating premises of the book, as you've historically laid it out, that disease functions as a metaphor for the colonial, degradation of subjects. That aspirations get treated as disease, as infected bodies. So even as the metaphors are clearly apparent, there's a point at which I think we find that the metaphors become insufficient, and I think it is living through a pandemic that forces us to confront the existential meanings. As I think you said it just now so eloquently, so that. And this goes well beyond metaphors. I find your discussion of disease as metaphor very helpful, because at a certain point, metaphor ceases to be relevant. And analogies break down when the materiality of what is gestured towards as metaphor becomes your daily reality. And I'll just give you an example that, just think of how often we have to catch ourselves when we use the term viral. The video went viral, right? And we never thought twice about it before last year. But I think, since the pandemic, it's become extremely difficult for us to use the word viral when contagion's deadly effects are simply not amenable to being reduced to a metaphorical life, simply as adjectives that you apply in other contexts. And there was a key instance in your last chapter where I thought the metaphors reach a breaking point, and you actually bring that out. It's not even me as a reader seeing it there, and this is when you write about the 9/11 Commission report, which you fascinatingly read as a literary text. I didn't know that this 9/11 Commission report had been nominated for a National Book Award for nonfiction. That's incredible. And you do this really astounding reading of it. But you cite a very striking passage in the report, which calls for better security measures against future attacks. In other words, a cure against Islamic terrorism. And the report uses hospital analogies, and I'm just quoting from it. The agencies are like a set of specialists in a hospital, each ordering tests, looking for symptoms, and prescribing medications. What is missing is the attending physician who makes sure they work as a team. So it wasn't just the hospital analogy that I found interesting. Even more so is your comment that to read this line in a pandemic where public health measures have been ignored or challenged, it's impossible not to read the report's words as disingenuous, as physicians have metaphorical, not actual value in the war against terror. And you write, these imaginary physicians are only metaphorical. They only have figural status. And so there's a recognition that you bring to the book that the pandemic really exposes the fragility of these metaphors, and to the point that the metaphors become a vanishing point, and the reader has to confront the historical reality that metaphors dance around. And I think this is really what your book does in the long run. It brings up the metaphors, and you unpack what those metaphors have done historically over a group of texts. And then you, by the end of the book, I think what you show is that these are just metaphors that mask a historical reality, which we now actually recognize as our living reality. And it's for that reason that I felt that metaphors become a vanishing point in your book. And and I think probably we're running out of time, but it would be great before we go for the Q&A. But I just thought it might be nice to hear your thoughts about metaphors and their undoing in the age of the pandemic.
I appreciate so much the phrase vanishing point. I think that's really helpful, and it's not a phrase that I thought of when I was writing this. I mean, at the risk of being emotional, I think I should say I was so angry when I was finalizing the proofs for that last chapter, because all around us, we saw an entire political system ignoring medical specialists. And it was the same bigoted people who pretended that the response to 9/11 was medically rational and serious. And I was just furious for the doctors and nurses and health aides and custodial workers who are risking their lives every day and being so profoundly disrespected by the state, not protected in any way, no PPE. And I, writing a book like this, there are a lot of emotional challenges and a lot of anger. You use the word masks in this context, and I think that that word too has reached a kind of vanishing point for us in this moment of face coverings in public and the importance of masking. But it's also the name of your first book, and it's also the training that gave me the idea that disciplines like English literature in your work or epidemiology in my work are masks, and they're masks of hegemony, they're masks of conquest. So the metaphor, even when it reaches its vanishing point, the puzzling thing about it is that it has so much political material significance. Even though we can unpack it and see what the history is, even though we can say this is just a metaphor, they didn't even mean this thing about the physician in the 9/11 Commission report. And by the way, for anybody who's still here, if you read one chapter of the book, I think read chapter 7, because because there just isn't a lot of good writing about the 9/11 Commission report, and no real critical writing about the Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture, which is also in that chapter. I think I'm proudest of that work because it was so very hard. But just let me wrap it up by saying, because a metaphor has a vanishing point and ceases to mean poetically, does not mean that it ceases to impact our lives in extremely material and crucial ways. And that is the difficult takeaway for me at the end of writing this book.
That's a great place to end. And wow, this is, I really strongly recommend that those of you who are in attendance, this is a book that must be read, and it's a book that really speaks so urgently to the issues of our day, and just written beautifully, written so movingly. And as I said, I think this is really, it's a hopeful and very, I found a very comforting end. Now, I don't mean comforting in the sense of just assuaging, one sense of responsibility, but it was a very hopeful way of thinking about, this kind of shared community of response. So I see that there are questions lined up. So maybe, Anjali, I'll just read them out to you. I don't know if you can also see the questions, but the
Yes.
first one is by Phoebe Cohen. And the question is, one thing that stood out to me is the connection between colonialism, imperialism, and the foundation of the scientific field of epidemiology. It's really profound to me that colonialism, imperialism has led to both the metaphor of terrorism as an epidemic, as well as actual epidemics due to the exposure of populations to new diseases, intentional and unintentional. And I'd love to hear you speak more about this connection and what your historical research covered on this. So would you like to take up this question?
Sure. Hi, Phoebe. Thank you so much for this question. Phoebe is a geologist, so she has taught me a ton about scientific discourse and also is my rocks dictionary. So I think that what I want to say is, I'm just looking over the details of your question again. Yeah. So I go into this a bit in chapter 2 of the book. I think the best example I can give is let me give you a super brief overview of how cholera moved. So it started in the Sundarbans, and it was endemic to this region. And because of deforestation by East India Company troops, the disturbance of the waterways, and then the movement of literally that natural extracted resource of wood for the building of East India Company. The movement of troops from that region was what created the first epidemic in India in 1817. So like even the very exceeding of the endemic condition to the epidemic condition was a result of imperial just day-to-day business, right? Taking wood, moving it somewhere else. Very quickly over the course of the next century, there were attempts to blame others for the movement of cholera. So in the 1830s outbreak, you see a real obsession with Hindu pilgrimage. So this is British commentators and physicians, although they weren't always medically trained, reaching for answers like, why is this disease spreading? And their answer in the 1830s was, it's Hindu pilgrimage, it's the Kumbh Mela, it's all these people going and drinking water and taking ritual baths. And then by the 1850s, they were saying something different. They were saying, well, wait, no, it's Muslim pilgrimage. It's the Hajj to Mecca and Medina that is causing a worldwide, now it's spreading to Europe, now it's getting to the shores of the Americas. And even, I don't know, I hope I'm not getting too into the weeds, but a detail that I really love from John Slate's History of the Hajj is that in the 1850s, the British company Thomas Cook, which we remember from traveler's checks from when we were teenagers before we could use debit cards everywhere, that company, Thomas Cook, was running basically a Hajj cruise ship. So the enrichment of British imperial companies was taking place on the basis of like selling travel, moving goods, creating roadways, creating railway networks, shipping things all around the world. And it was their very paths of movement that caused the first global epidemic. So the question went away because it went into the answered area. Yes, so the historical research basically uncovered that the fights in the 1850s in this international sanitary conferences were basically about like, does British liberalism want to confess that this disease is contagious, or does it want to keep its trade successes and not shut things down? I mean, this is going to sound so familiar to you now, but it's like, what about the economy? If we admit that this is contagious, what about our international economy that we've just built? So I think that historical nexus is really important to me. Let me leave it there, and we can discuss further another day if I missed part of your question. Something fell in the back of the studio, so I also got a bit distracted for a second.
Yeah, so maybe we can move on to the next question. It may be the last one because we are running out of time and it's a long question. Thank you, question and comment. Thank you both for this wonderful conversation. I love the idea that this disease is an archive, and it makes me wonder if we turn the analogy around, what your own archive and book represents through the lens of epistemology of ideas. Using illness as metaphor is an ancient technique of authoritarian leaders to vilify, remove unwanted people. Is it fair to say that you are working to assemble a set of ideas that vaccinate people from falling for this rhetorical trick? I mean, that's an interesting word to use here, vaccinate. Are you adding to the organism of ideas on this tactic? Or would you abandon the biological metaphor and see your book as accomplishing something else entirely?
I love this question. So this question is from Eric Nook, a former student of mine at Columbia, who is just about to begin an assistant professorship at Princeton in psychology. So I just also want to celebrate the brilliant career of this person. And thank you for asking me this terribly hard question, Eric. Okay, I don't think that I would say my book is trying to vaccinate. I mean, I certainly like to spin the idea of like inoculation, attenuated virus, like limited exposure or exposure therapy. But I don't think that we can prevent the use of biological metaphors. And I don't think that I necessarily would want to. You ask about abandoning the biological metaphor and trying to accomplish something else. I will say I was very careful as I wrote to at least acknowledge when I was using biological language, for example, effloresce or ramify. Some of these verbs aren't even things that we would think of as having metaphorical relationships to plants, for example, in efflorescence or ramification, which is an unfurling of a leaf or a vine. But you know, because we use language as our medium of thought, I don't think that we can or ought to try to get away from metaphors. What I hope is that we are more careful about how and when we use them, and that particularly in this moment when epidemics are not even remotely abstract, but are in fact the material conditions of our everyday, that we take more seriously the material impacts of figural language, especially when it comes from politicians or people with a huge public platform. I think I write in the beginning of the book about Andrew Cuomo comparing the first outbreak of COVID-19 in New York to 9/11. And I said this in an interview a couple of months ago, but what I hope is that every single reader of this book gets angry when they hear that and has something to say about what that means and how wrong-headed it is. So, you know, I don't know that this book will end up in the hands of any politicians or leaders, but if it does, I think best case scenario, they really take a hard look at how they're using language and how it spreads. And worst case scenario, they at least know someone is watching them, and it's me.
Okay, so yeah, I suppose in a way you just talked about this because we have another question from Joan Savitt who's asked, I'm confused about the discussion of metaphors. Can you clarify a bit more? So would you like to, reflect more on, I think the earlier question was that Eric who asked about, are you still wedded to a biological method of reading?
Mm-hmm. I think that the discussion of metaphor for me, especially with regard to health, proceeds from Susan Sontag's illness as metaphor. And I still think it's really helpful to imagine that, or to remember that for Sontag, she's talking about the way that the medical community, when she was diagnosed with cancer, gave her metaphors of military operations. So her doctors and the people that she talked to kept saying to her, you know, you're going to beat this. This is your war on cancer. We're going to do a battle against cancer. And her writing in the 1970s on her own diagnosis, and then later in the 1990s on the HIV/AIDS discourse, really sharpened our collective understanding of what we lose when we use a metaphor like battle to talk about cancer. I'm going to leave that aside because that's not my subject and say my subject almost works in reverse. I'm asking, what do we lose when we compare terrorism to a virus? We lose the humanity of the people We lose an ability to take care of actual viruses when they do arise because we've poured trillions and trillions of dollars into a US military apparatus in order to prevent or cure the disease of Islamist terrorism abroad. So I guess the briefest answer I can give is this metaphor is a trick. And back to Eric's question from a couple of minutes ago, I'm hoping to give readers the tools not to fall for that trick, and to be more stay on our toes about what our government is telling us and what our taxes are used for, and where we put our energies, and what we demand from our leaders in terms of their responsibilities to us. A 20-year overseas war that has displaced 37 million people and killed 800,000 civilians is not preventative disease measure. That's a war. And I think being non-metaphorical about that is important.
Well, I think in the beginning of the talk, in your intro, you talked about the humanitarian, the care, kind of the care agenda behind security measures. And I think one of the kind of the lasting memories of your book is your description of the vaccination ruse that was used to capture and kill Osama bin Laden. So, I mean, that's a context that a lot of people often forget, right? The very possibility of finding out, of finding Osama's location and then launching the assault on him was through this vaccination program, right? Again, I think going to your point about the security regime using humanitarian health issues as an alibi for invasion and conquest.
Yeah. And the last thing I will say, because Audrey's here to tell us to close up shop, but the last thing I'll say on this is that CIA vaccination ruse led to, directly and indirectly, to your question of transmission and cause and effect, led to polio becoming epidemic again in Pakistan. So there are grave consequences to this kind of trickery. It's immoral and it's indefensible.
Wow, I really wish we could keep going with this conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but luckily there is a beautiful book you can check out if you are interested in having this conversation continue. There are links in the chat if you would like to purchase Epidemic Empire. Anjuli, Gauri, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. This has really been a wonderful talk. And thank you all at home for tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, indie book selling, and our incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. If you'd like to support Anjuli, check out the link in the chat to purchase Epidemic Empire. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. From all of us at Harvard Bookstore, have a great night, have a great day, stay safe, keep wearing your masks, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anjali.
Thanks, Gauri. Wish we could have a hug soon.
It'll happen.
Take care.
Happen.